A very good evening to you and Merry Christmas. Welcome to our program, Diplomatic Faces. And this is a program where we exchange thoughts and ideas on the importance of geopolitics and also about the initiatives taken by various leaders for the betterment of the community. So today with us on the program, we have the Australian High Commissioner to Sri Lanka, His Excellency Paul Stevens. A very good evening to you and Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas to you too. Merry Christmas to everyone watching. Thank you. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you here with us on our program on Christmas Day. And today we're going to talk about you and also about most of the initiatives you've taken, not only in Sri Lanka, but the world over, and also your experiences. So my first question would be about why you selected the foreign affairs related stream. What was it that made you pick this?
Sure. Firstly, can I say just what a great privilege it is to be Australia's High Commissioner here in Sri Lanka. I love the opportunity to be here. And I also love Australia, I love my country, but I think one of the great attractions of serving overseas, of being in this field, is that you get the opportunity to understand a culture and understand a people in a really deep way. I think travel for tourism, of course, it's great and it's great fun, but it's only when you're living and working overseas that you really get the opportunity to understand and immerse yourself in a culture in a way which is very deep and very meaningful, and that's really attractive to me. That's mostly why I've been involved in diplomacy and international affairs for most of my career. I think it's also a great opportunity to make a difference. So, for example, here in Sri Lanka, I've only been here 4 months so far, but it's an opportunity to help to strengthen the relationship, to do some things which are good for both countries and which are good for the Sri Lankan people in their current circumstances as well.
What really captured your eye in Sri Lanka? You've been here for 4 months, Your Excellency.
Well, unfortunately, I haven't had that much chance to travel outside of Colombo so far. I've been to Kandy, I've also been to Galle and Hambantota on official visits, so I'm very much looking forward to getting out and seeing the rest of the country. It's obviously a really beautiful place, and I'm interested in seeing the mountains, the plantations, the north, everywhere, the beaches, which I think would be great once I get those opportunities.
They say that Sri Lanka is a tropical haven and you get to visit a lot of different environments and weather conditions as well. As you did mention, you should certainly visit around the country as well. So at the same time, we're going to talk about your experiences away from Sri Lanka. That's right before you joined Sri Lanka. So you've been attached to the Australian mission in Sweden and also in Thailand, countries like Brazil as well. So tell us a bit about your most unforgettable incidences. What really made you be happy about being in this field?
Well, perhaps not so much about what made me happy, but what I found satisfying and interesting. A few years ago, many years ago I guess by now, I was working at Australia's mission to the United Nations in New York, and part of my responsibilities there was to look after international security issues, including at the time Iraq, and Iraq was at that time the most high-profile international issue on the international agenda. And so New York was kind of like the centre of gravity for what was going on and international consideration about how to approach and respond to the situation in Iraq. So to be immersed in that, to be talking to colleagues and others who were in the Security Council where key decisions were being taken, where Australia had real interests at stake as well, was very satisfying. Also, it was a time, and it's not always like this, it was a time where there was very high level attention from the Australian government on what I was doing and the advocacy I was able to do on behalf of the Australian government and the reporting we were able to do from New York. So that was a really exciting time to be a diplomat when what we were doing really mattered. I think a very different example is when I was based more recently at our embassy in Bangkok, and we undertook a project there whereby we curated a documentary which told the story of His Majesty the King of Thailand's time in Australia. He spent quite a lot of time in Australia as a student and as a military cadet, and this had all been documented on archival footage, which through quite a long process the embassy managed to curate into a professional documentary, which we showed on Thai television, but we also used it as a vehicle to invite His Majesty the King to come to the Australian Ambassador's residence for a reception. That was a completely unprecedented event. It had never happened before, and I think it will never happen again either. But it was a great way to be able to tell a story about how Australia and Thailand had this amazing history through His Majesty the King, and it was a great way for us to be able to, I guess, express and enhance our influence within Thailand through this documentary as well.
That's interesting as well at the same time, because Thailand has a very long history and culture, and being a part of this probably did give you a bit more exposure to different cultures.
Oh, definitely. I mean, as I said at the start, I mean, the chance to live in different cultures, to experience different cultures, different religions, different cuisines, different ethnic compositions, it's all part of what makes serving overseas and living overseas as a diplomat extremely interesting.
And you've been attached and associated with South Asia for a long time, even before you were appointed here in Sri Lanka. So tell us a bit about how this South Asian region becomes geographically important to the world.
I think the geopolitical centre of gravity has shifted to the Indo-Pacific area, and the Indo-Pacific area spans a very large geography from the Pacific Island countries through to Southeast Asia, mainland and maritime Southeast Asia, through South Asia, all the way across the Indian Ocean and even over to the coast of Africa. And I think what's happening in South Asia and in the Indian Ocean region is really a reflection of what's happening in the Indo-Pacific more broadly. And what that is enhanced geostrategic competition between the major powers. Obviously, the US and China being the two major powers, we're seeing increased contest between them. We are seeing increased militarisation generally in the Indo-Pacific as well. And those sorts of factors are all playing out in South Asia as well. In South Asia or in the Indian Ocean region more broadly, you have another factor as well, which of course is the presence of India. India being such a growing and influential world power. Soon it will become the world's most populous country. It's already the 5th biggest economy and will probably be the 3rd biggest economy by the end of the decade. So I think the context in South Asia is different because you have more of a three-way dynamic, with not just with the two major powers, US and China, but also with the extremely large and powerful emerging power of India as well.
And Your Excellency, people smuggling has become quite a concern, and I think Australia and Sri Lanka in the recent past, we've been giving a lot of advice and also telling people how they need to migrate legally. So tell us a bit about how we could bring an end to this critical situation we're facing right now in terms of people smuggling.
Well, firstly, can I just say that the cooperation that Australia and Sri Lanka enjoy in terms of countering many forms of transnational crime, including people smuggling, is absolutely gold standard. We are, from the Australian side, thrilled with the collaboration that has been ongoing for quite some time, that we have with the Sri Lankan Navy, the Coast Guard, the Air Force, the Ministry of Defence more broadly, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs as well. We really see it as I said, as a gold standard example of how we can cooperate on this very difficult transnational crime challenge. I think that the response to people smuggling in particular here in Sri Lanka has a few different facets to it. There is a push factor, which is caused by the difficult circumstances of Sri Lanka at the moment, and hopefully once the situation here continues to stabilise and the economy moves on to a growth path, then that push factor will dissipate. I think we also have an issue with messaging. So we are very strong from the Australian side in terms of promoting the zero chance message, the zero chance narrative, and that means what it sounds like, which is if you are a people smuggler, or if you are someone who is considering getting on one of these vessels, then you actually have zero chance of getting to Australia. We have really strong cooperation which deters and prevents operations here in Sri Lanka, which deters and prevents them and detains them on the water. And then even if a vessel were to get to Australian waters, people are not, they still don't get to enter Australia. They're processed offshore in Nauru or another third country. So there really is a zero chance that people will get to Australia through these illegal means. I think the other aspect to that is, we are very concerned to protect the safety of lives at sea. That's really the overriding motivation for us. And it is a fact that the vessels that are being proposed for these trips are very often unseaworthy, they're very often very small, and tragically there have been cases where these vessels have sunk and lives at sea have been lost. So our interest is very much to stop these vessels from leaving in the first place, if at all possible, as a top priority, so that the lives of vulnerable people are not risked and compromised. So that's the messaging side, but also there's, as I mentioned, the operational cooperation, which is very long-standing and also very effective, and we are grateful to the Sri Lankan agencies for that.
And I'm sure during this program, at the latter part of the program, we'll talk about how people can actually legally visit Australia, and there are many other purposes to visit Australia, for tourism and also for studies, to work. So there are many legal ways in which you could visit another country. So we will come to that later. But we're going to talk about the Australia-Sri Lanka relationship. The first Australian High Commissioner to Sri Lanka arrived in our island in 1947. So the Australia-Sri Lanka relationship dates back to the 40s. So can you take us through the journey of the Australia-Sri Lanka relationship from its beginning?
Well, I don't know if I can take you through the whole 75 years, but it is a 75-year relationship. It is the anniversary of diplomatic relations between Australia and Sri Lanka this year. In fact, Australia recognised an independent Ceylon before Ceylon was even independent. But I think way back then in 1946, Sri Lanka was probably viewed as a very far-off destination, a very exotic destination. But I think over the course of the 75 years, we've seen the relationship become much stronger. We've seen people-to-people links through education, through tourism, through diaspora links really grow and strengthen to the extent that now, we don't see Sri Lanka as a far-off, exotic, distant location, but more as a neighbour. As an Indian Ocean neighbour, where we share a lot of interests and values, and our relationship has really strengthened over the course of 75 years, and we think it will continue to strengthen going forward.
That's amazing, and as you mentioned, it marks 75 years since the Australia-Sri Lanka relationship commenced. So I mentioned previously that we will be talking about legal means of Sri Lankans visiting Australia. So there is a community, Sri Lankan community living in Australia currently, around 170,000 people living in Australia. So what are the opportunities like for Sri Lankans who wish to study in Australia, work in Australia, visit Australia?
Yeah, firstly, can I just say that the Sri Lankan diaspora in Australia does make a really positive, really strong and cohesive contribution to Australian society and Australian community. There's a particularly strong focus of Sri Lankans in Melbourne, but they're also in a number of other cities around Australia, Sydney and Perth and others, and we really value what they bring and their contribution. In terms of the pathways for travel to Australia, I'm really pleased that the level of Sri Lankan students in Australia is now up to 11,000, which is almost back to the same level before COVID, when it was around 13,000. So obviously during COVID, those sorts of opportunities for international education exchange fell away, but now we're almost back to where we were before COVID. There are also many Sri Lankans who are applying each week to travel to Australia through visitor visa processes. We get about 550 applications each week at the High Commission for visitor visas. And can I just say too that our processing times for those visas is now at about 3 weeks, which is really very quick. I think if you looked at it in terms of some of our counterpart embassies and high commissions here in Colombo, that there wouldn't be any of them processing their visas that quickly. So that's a really good pathway, obviously, for people to visit. Also, Australia recently announced an intention to increase our skilled migration quota from 160,000 each year to 195,000, which is intended to provide, again, legal pathways for skilled migrants to visit Australia and work in Australia. So that's an overall international quota, but of course Sri Lankans are more than welcome to be able to apply through that mechanism as well.
And Your Excellency, Sri Lanka and Australia are both under the Commonwealth umbrella. So how can we strengthen our bilateral ties under this banner?
Sure. I think the great thing about the Commonwealth is that it has a very diverse membership. It has countries from Africa, from South Asia, from Southeast Asia, from the Pacific, from the Caribbean. So this diversity is really part of the strength of the Commonwealth. And I think the Commonwealth provides a really good platform for discussion and exchange and collaboration around the important issues of the day, including economic recovery after COVID, including obviously issues like climate change as well. The core business of the Commonwealth is really around promotion of democracy and good governance and human rights and strong institutions. And that's the sorts of areas that Australia looks to use the Commonwealth platform in order to strengthen with all Commonwealth countries and obviously including Sri Lanka as part of that.
And Your Excellency, the bilateral relationship encompasses a development cooperation and also education and close collaboration on countering people smuggling, as we discussed before. So what are the areas that Australia is looking to strengthen its developing or development cooperation in Sri Lanka?
Sure. I think there are a couple of components. The first is in terms of helping Sri Lanka to meet the immediate humanitarian needs, just given the economic difficulties that the country is facing. So the Australian government has announced a contribution of 75 million Australian dollars for humanitarian support to Sri Lanka just this year. That represents a massive increase in our overall development cooperation funding to Sri Lanka. As I said, it's really more short-term focused to help those most vulnerable communities and people in Sri Lanka right at the moment. It's focused primarily on food security, on health services, and on women and children who are in that most vulnerable category. So that's $75 million for humanitarian support in the 75th year of the bilateral relationship. That's a coincidence, but it still makes a nice kind of catch line. But beyond just the immediate humanitarian need, we're also really focused on helping the Sri Lankan economy to reorient itself to a growth path, which includes reorienting to a more export-oriented economy as well. So a number of our ongoing development cooperation projects are intended to help with that. For example, we provide support to the tourism sector through a program called Skills for Inclusive Growth, which skills up young Sri Lankans to be able to participate in the tourism and hospitality sector, which is obviously a key driver of growth here in Sri Lanka. We have programs intended to increase women's participation in the labour force, which is really an untapped resource here in Sri Lanka. The labour force participation rate by women is quite low, and bringing that up will really provide a driver for the economy. And like I said before, we're also looking at increasing the export readiness of a number of Sri Lankan businesses, SMEs, and others, so that they're producing not just for the domestic market, but they can expand their business to other markets internationally as well.
That's, I think, a great initiative in terms of coming out of the crisis situation we are facing currently in Sri Lanka, and that has, as you mentioned, Your Excellency, that has led to people trying to make hasty decisions and believing whatever the others say, because we have a lot of illiterate community as well in the rural areas, and when somebody gives them a promise that they can, go abroad to Australia easily, they believe it, they tend to accept that offer. So that is what we see these days, and I think this is a way we could spread awareness as to how dangerous it can be to migrate to another country legally. And Your Excellency, thank you for mentioning a lot of legal ways in which people could actually visit Australia, and also through skilled working scheme as well. And Your Excellency, Australia is actually a high income earning country and is ranked 14th in the world. So that is a success story for Australia as well. So we are in the process of coming out of this crisis. So why don't you share the success story with us?
Well, firstly, can I say Australia is not a perfect country. We have our own challenges, our own economic, social and community challenges that we need to meet, and which we will continue to deal with in the years ahead. But as you say, Australia is generally a successful society, and I think there are a few elements to that. Diversity is a big part of it. We're a diverse and multi-ethnic community. There have been several waves of migration to Australia over many decades, including a wave of European migration after the Second World War. Then in the 1970s there was a strong wave of migration from Southeast Asia, and since then we've seen migration from North Asia, from the Middle East, and from South Asia as well too. In particular, not just Sri Lanka, but India is actually the quickest growing community within Australia. So this kind of diversity has really helped to build strong community links. We also have the world's oldest living Indigenous culture in Australia, so a 65,000 year Indigenous culture, which is again part of the...
It's, I think, a great initiative in terms of coming out of the crisis situation we are facing currently in Sri Lanka, and that has, as you mentioned, Your Excellency, that has led to people trying to make hasty decisions and believing whatever the others say, because we have a lot of illiterate community as well in the rural areas, and when somebody gives them a promise that they can, go abroad to Australia easily, they believe it, they tend to accept that offer. So that is what we see these days, and I think this is a way we could spread awareness as to how dangerous it can be to migrate to another country legally. And Your Excellency, thank you for mentioning a lot of legal ways in which people could actually visit Australia, and also through skilled working scheme as well. And Your Excellency, Australia is actually a high income earning country and is ranked 14th in the world. So that is a success story for Australia as well. So we are in the process of coming out of this crisis. So why don't you share the success story with us?
Well, firstly, can I say Australia is not a perfect country. We have our own challenges, our own economic, social and community challenges that we need to meet, and which we will continue to deal with in the years ahead. But as you say, Australia is generally a successful society, and I think there are a few elements to that. Diversity is a big part of it. We're a diverse and multi-ethnic community. There have been several waves of migration to Australia over many decades, including a wave of European migration after the Second World War. Then in the 1970s there was a strong wave of migration from Southeast Asia, and since then we've seen migration from North Asia, from the Middle East, and from South Asia as well too. In particular, not just Sri Lanka, but India is actually the quickest growing community within Australia. So this kind of diversity has really helped to build strong community links. We also have the world's oldest living Indigenous culture in Australia, so a 65,000 year Indigenous culture, which is again part of the diverse nature of our country. It's worth considering too that according to the latest census, 50% of Australians were either born overseas themselves or they had a parent who was born overseas. So I guess that just does represent how kind of diverse and multi-ethnic we are, we also are a country which prides ourselves on giving everyone a fair go. So what that means is that there is opportunity, that we do have, I guess, a merit-based approach to advancement, so that people are able to take advantage of this fair go approach. So I think tolerance and diversity, and then an adherence to issues like rule of law, etc., are kind of what has helped to make Australia such a diverse and successful country overall.
And we've come towards the latter part of the program as well, so this will be my final question. How do you intend to further enhance the bilateral relationship between the two countries, and what's plans in store for the future?
Sure. I think there are a range of ways in which we can strengthen what is already a very strong and good relationship. One of those areas is investment in both directions. There are a number of Australian companies, particularly in the resources sector, but also the energy sector, which are interested in investing in Sri Lanka, and it would be great if we can start to realise some of those investments, which would be mutually beneficial for our countries. I think I mentioned energy. I think renewables is a sector where Australia has a lot of assets and expertise and technology, and Sri Lanka also has a lot of need, but also assets of its own in terms of its hydro capacity, but also solar and wind potential. So renewables, and the renewables sector is one where there's real potential for growth, and I guess that leads into climate change as well, which is a critical challenge for us. The Australian government has committed to net zero by 2050. We've committed $2 billion to climate financing up to 2030, so we are really keen and interested in playing our part in helping the region and the international community address the climate challenge, and we definitely think that Sri Lanka can be a strong partner for us in that. I mentioned earlier the need to build up resilience and sovereignty in the Indo-Pacific, but in particular in the Indian Ocean itself. We are really keen to help countries such as Sri Lanka build up the sovereign capacity to be able to make the right decisions that can safeguard its resilience. Education is already a very strong part of the relationship, but I think there is potential to do more there. There's definitely interest from Australian universities and institutions in investing here and setting up campuses here, and if the enabling environment were to be a bit more conducive, then I think we could see that start to happen as well. So these are some of the areas that I think there is potential. I think on trade and investment also, Sri Lanka has great potential as a transshipment hub and a logistics hub. It has a perfect location here in the Indian Ocean on shipping routes and trade routes. Australia is an exporting country. We rely on international markets for our economic growth and strength, and there's real potential there as well to build up Sri Lanka's capacity as a transshipment and logistics hub.
And that's great news indeed, and there's a lot of avenues which we can work on in terms of building the bilateral relationship with the country. And it was really nice talking to you, Your Excellency. Thank you very much for being a part of the show.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It was very interesting. It was a great pleasure to be here, and I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you so much once again, Your Excellency. And with that, we've come towards the close of the program. Thank you very much for tuning in. And this brings to the close of Diplomatic Faces, featuring the Australian High Commissioner to Sri Lanka and the Maldives, His Excellency Paul Stevens.